You might have heard the Hollywood term technical director or technical artist, especially in games or VFX. I'm going to break down exactly what one is, what it pays, and how to become one. So if you're a digital artist, 3D artist, compositor, let's explore how to become a technical director in VFX or games. When I first got into 3D, I was messing about. I didn't really have a lot of direction. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I loved effects. Back in the 90s, there wasn't an official effects position available. It was just 3D generalist. The term generalist didn't even exist. It meant that we had to model, texture, animate, do all these different things, and we couldn't really do one specific thing. We had to kind of spread out and handle every single bit that came at us. Now, I remember reading an article by Michael Comet, who works for Pixar, and at the time he was working for Volition. They made the game Descent. I don't know what else they really did, but he wrote an article which I think he talked about the different roles in 3D, maybe. I don't really remember. It was about 23, 24 years ago, something like that. But one thing he brought up was the role of a technical director. And he described this as being someone who is an artist, but they also know the technical side. They also can code. And it kind of meant that this person was kind of the best of both worlds, because you'd have a lot of the R&D people who are coding and programming, scripting, automating, and then you'd have all the artists. And to kind of hear about a role somewhere in the middle where you could be technical and you could also be an artist, that instantly resonated for me. That was just so clear. It's like, wow, I finally know what I want to do. I want to be a technical director. And I set my goal that by 40, which would actually be about now, that was my goal, that if I could become a technical director by then in Hollywood, then that would be my big goal. And I remember by 19, I was a senior technical director for a pretty big studio in Australia. So I kind of got to the goal a lot quicker than expected, but having that guidance, having clarity about what I wanted to do changed everything. So that was really important for me, is understanding what all the roles were in visual effects, so that way I could self-identify for what I wanted, and that was so important. So at that point, once I knew what I wanted to do, it was a matter of understanding, well, what does the role entail? What are the requirements? How do I become a technical director? And so because of that, I started to map out my whole path, my whole career map to becoming a TD in Hollywood and doing all this stuff. And understanding also like what I was lacking, which was a lot. I lacked almost everything. I really had the drive. That was the main thing that really kind of controlled me to go further. So that was important. At least self-identifying, knowing what I wanted, it meant that I now could identify as one day I want to be a technical director. Because I think a lot of us don't have that initial goal. So I think it's really important to understand what we want. And the best way to do that is to understand, well, what type of roles are there? So even specifically with technical directors, there's different types. So at a medium-sized studio, you might be a technical director, but at a large studio, if you're going to Industrial Light and Magic or Weta or Framestore, perhaps you're going to be a very specific niche of a technical director or a TD. In other words, you could be a character TD, or you could be a lighting TD, or an effects TD, a comp TD, or compositing TD. So there's all these different types, and even within that, you can splinter off further. For effects, you could be a fluids TD, or for character TD, you could actually be a hair TD or cloth TD, meaning that you specifically just focus on cloth simulations and troubleshooting bad setups, things like that as well. So there's lots of different ones. Pipeline TD, even with lighting, you've got shading as well. So shader TDs, lighting TDs, comp TDs typically mean that you might be a technical director working in Nuke, doing a lot of stuff in that area as well. So there's different types within that as well. But typically I advise to become a technical director. Don't necessarily splinter off too much initially. Learn the lay of the land, because me being a TD, that doesn't mean I just do fluids or I just do effects. I might be doing pipeline stuff. I might be doing comp stuff. The more that I can serve all the different departments, the more I become highly irreplaceable in my company, in my team that I'm working for. So I think that's really important. You can then eventually evolve into more of a sub-niche area, but it's good to initially be able to understand where you can contribute the most in what areas and what type of roles there are, but then from there you can move on from that. But basically a TD is either going to be someone who's working on shots. In other words, you're going to be doing effects or you're going to be doing cloth on a specific shot. But other times you might specifically just be supporting your team. So that means especially as a pipeline TD, but in general, you might be helping out the team, building tools, and just making sure that everything's running smoothly. If someone runs into an issue, and perhaps you're more self-aware of all the different problems that people might run into, and you're able to help them when they hit a wall and they can't figure out what's going on, because you know the software better than they do, at least when it comes to the technical side of things. So let's talk a bit about what a technical director does. Like I said, they handle the technical side, that's pretty obvious, but it also means that you're building scripts. You know, you might be automating certain tasks, and in some cases you're developing tools and you're working on the pipeline, and you could also be supporting the team around you. It other times can be that you're handling tricky shots, and that means that there might be a very specific shot. They're like, how are we going to pull this off? And then a bunch of TDs can come together and figure that out. I remember on Superman Returns, the head TD for the studio that I was working with, we had been developing Krakatoa. That was like a particle point renderer, or like a volumetric point renderer, which has become pretty popular these days. And at the time, we had done it for some like thin, wispy stuff. Like that's all we had really pushed it for. And then Superman came along. Then we got really heavy into developing it for volumetrics. And I was involved in blowing up the sun and Krypton at the very beginning of Superman Returns. And at the time, it was looking really cool. The director, the VFX soup, especially on our side, was pushing like, hey, we want more particles. And we ended up getting to like 700 million particles, which at the time was the most I'd ever heard of any movie ever having particle-wise. These days, you've got billions of particles, it's not a big deal. But at the time, it meant that there was a technical director who came along and he was just handling making partitions of my particles. So I'd be doing the effects, but the TD could go and work on just creating iterations and then caching them all out and then rendering them all together to create these massive particle counts. So sometimes a TD is someone who's going to go in there and be able to work on a specific area and really make it sing. If I were having to cache everything out plus work on creating the shot and everything, it'd be a lot to do, but having someone who's technical, who understands the requirements, knows what's to do, they're able to go off and handle that thing. So sometimes it's about problem solving. It's about figuring out what direction to take things or what solutions to try. Other times you might hit a wall in production and be like, I can't figure this out. TD might be able to jump on there and say, let me try a few things, figure out a solution. But when it comes to scripting, automation, tool development, that I think is really a big portion of what a technical director does. And the way that I see things is that if you were to look at Maya, Houdini, Max, anytime you click a button, that button is actually calling the API. It's calling a script essentially to do that command that you're telling it to do. Every single button that you're pressing inside of your 3D program essentially is a custom-made script. So the best way to look at this is that what if you had buttons specifically made for your production? So instead of having the ArcViz stuff and the trees and the foliage and the grass, and also having garment makers and essentially the 3D programs that you use addressing every type of production, every type of team, every type of company in the world, you instead can come along and say, well, I don't care about any of that. I'm just going to make buttons that are specific to this production. A good example in my FXTD mentorship was that we learned how to create a vampire ashing because I worked on Blade and all these other movies. I've ashed way too many creatures in my career. But what I thought was interesting is, well, instead of just manually going in and like 5 artists go and create all the fire, the smoke, the ash, the sparks, all the different bits and pieces, the skeleton crumbling apart, all the different bits and pieces of the effect. What if we develop it once and then we build a tool around it? So that way we click a button called Ash Me, I think it was, and we can then click the character, dial in the settings like it happens on this frame. We can click a point on the body that starts there. We can choose the speed of how it is able to spread over the body, and then how much fire we want, how many embers. Hit a button, and then everything just generates. All the fluid sims, all the effects, everything we need just automatically is created. That was an example that I developed for my mentorship to show, first, let's create the effect, but then from there, let's automate the effect. Let's make a button. So that way what we can do is we can build the effect, but then we can hand it out to all the junior or mid-level artists, and they can then go and work on these shots without needing lots of experience, without needing to have a full understanding of how all this stuff works. They just need to say, well, I want it faster, so they dial up the faster spread, or I want the flames to live longer, so they bring down the death rates of the flames. All the different values are created in a way that makes sense to them, and it also is doing a lot under the hood, but they don't need to know about any of that stuff at all. That's the power of being able to build a tool out, so that way you're not hiring 10 really experienced, really expensive artists. You're able to work with a lot of mid or junior level artists doing all that stuff without them needing to know how it works. Kind of like driving a car. You don't need to understand how the car works, how the engine, carburetor, all the bits and pieces function. All you need to know is to hit the pedal and hit the brake and all the bits and pieces that you need to be able to go about what you need to do for getting from point A to point B. And that's exactly what we want to do. We want to simplify the process. So a lot of the time it is about, let's build a tool that can then submit a job to the render farm. And when the job is finished rendering, it then goes and puts it into a comp. And it spits out a QuickTime watermarked with the slate and everything else in there and puts it into the dailies folder for review. These are things that we can build out as a one-click process. And that way we don't need to do all the manual bits and pieces that typically might take 20 minutes, 30 minutes. But when you add them up, every time you got to do it, you're wasting hours and hours of time. So these are ways that you can streamline things as a technical director. But other times, like I said, you're working on shots, you're problem solving, you're doing all of this stuff. So the job might vary from day to day. And that's the exciting thing about it, is that you're not doing the same thing over and over. There's new challenges all the time. So let's talk about why these roles are so important. There's a huge demand for technical directors over any other role. And it's because they're the ones building solutions for projects. They're the ones who are creatives, but they also understand how to do the technical side too. I've known phenomenal animators who learned at least some scripting, and that it meant that they could build really intelligent rigs, or they could build out a process to be able to automate copying the keyframes from one character to another. It doesn't matter what you do. If you look at Photoshop or the actions you create, those actions essentially is a really rudimentary script that you're building. It's saving out the whole entire process so that way it can be repeated over and over again. So this is really important to understand, is that you don't need to be a massive technical whiz, but having some technical understanding is always going to benefit you. There's going to be that pushback that a lot of artists think, well, I don't need to do that and that won't apply to me. But ultimately, the more that you have the power to be able to talk to the software, to customize the software, to bend to your will, rather than you having to bend to it, then that changes everything. And it's really important to understand that. This is why there's such a huge demand for TDs over any other role, because these are the ones who get paid the most. These are the ones who have more opportunity because they're able to do more. They're able to go beyond what the software package is doing and actually use it in ways that create more opportunities for them. So this means that they become highly irreplaceable. One of my friends over at Weta, before he went over for Lord of the Rings, we're working on a production together. And I'd worked with him for years at a different studio, but then he came up, he's working with us. He was a technical director. I was a senior TD at the studio. And it was just interesting seeing him come in. He was a Maya TD, and he started writing all these scripts for all the team. Like every single time someone's like, hey, would you be able to do this? He'd spend half a day or a couple hours and he'd build a tool, and then not only would it solve that artist's problem, but it meant that every other artist in the entire studio could start using that tool to be able to get things done faster as well. And that was really important because it meant that beyond that production, beyond that project, they could continue to use that tool. It meant that now they have a button, now they have an interface, a process that would allow them to work faster, do more, and not have as much stress, as well as working back late as much, all these different things. It saves so much time. And bit by bit, the next tool they develop, the next thing, all the different solutions, it meant that there's always innovations, there's always new solutions coming out, that we're not waiting for Autodesk or Side Effects or whoever, Maxon, to come up with the solutions for us and beg and plead to make a button for it. We can do it ourselves. And in addition to that, it also meant that he wasn't just creating tools, he was working on certain commercials. There's one which I think was like a breakfast cereal commercial, and they needed to fold up like a breakfast cereal bowl with the milk and the cereal in it into a milk carton, and so kind of origami style, like fold it all up. And that was something that even I was like, I have no idea, like morph targets, like what's the best solution? I'd never heard of wrap deformers at the time, and that was the solution for it. Was figuring out, okay, if I use wrap deformers, I can then bend and fold this all up in that exact way that the client wants fairly easily and have complete control. Now, as a technical director, that means that the more that you have an understanding of all the software, the solutions, it means you're coming up with different ideas that might work a particular way. You're doing a lot of research, R&D, figuring out how do we tackle this, how do we tackle that. So that way, when it comes to doing the commercial, or even before you're awarded the commercial, this is a chance for you to come up with the solutions and say, yeah, when we land the project, the way we'll do it is this. And you could even build some basic setup and hand that off, or the rigged version that's very easy to manipulate, hand it over to an animator and let them do their thing. So again, all of this is to be able to give legs to the ways that you would typically do things in production. So again, that makes you highly irreplaceable, and that was exactly what Malcolm became. Instantly got offered a full-time job there, and I guarantee that as a TD, if there were ever to be laying artists off, he would become one of the last to get let go because he's become irreplaceable at the company. So this is exactly what I want us to think about, is that you think of software, like I said, as being just a bunch of scripts. Every button you press is essentially calling a script. It's like, well, what if I were to make my own buttons, make my own controls? If I could run a fluid sim that instantly fills up a cup of water exactly how I want every time I hit it, and I got to do that every single day. Or if I've got very specific lighting rigs or HDRI rigs that I want to copy across. I worked on The Equalizer, and I was working both over in Boston where we're filming the movie with Denzel, and then I'm working back in LA, and I was constantly jetting back. I think every week I was either in LA or Boston, and I was going back and forth all the time. So it meant that I needed to make sure that all the pipeline, the way that we worked, all mirrored correctly between both studios. So that way, when I'm in my studio in LA in Santa Monica, everything I'm working on would be my internal naming structure. But then when it came time to publish shots, I hit a button. Using the VPN, it would automatically upload all the files to their network. It would automatically rename them to the correct naming conventions that they used at their studio, and it would land in the exact folders where they need to be. So I can just message the compositor and say, hey, shots are over in the render directory or the comp directory. And he or she doesn't need to think about, well, okay, where does Allan store his stuff because he's externally, he's off-site. All he needs to do is go to where they would be, and they'll be there. In other words, I've built the tools that would automatically publish it all. In the same way that if someone was to say, hey, there's an updated camera track, I hit a button and it would go to Boston, grab the camera track, bring it into my shot, put it in the right location, name it all correctly, everything would work on my end. Instead of me having to manually go and name everything, rename it, move everything, make sure I'm not messing anything up. And the worst part is human error. Human error plays a big role in all of this because it's so easy when we're talking to people, we're doing too many things at once. That's when we start naming things incorrectly or storing in the wrong directory. Someone's like, hey, I'm looking for your file. Like, where is it? It's like, I put it in the right directory. You have no idea where you ended up putting it or what you actually called it because of human error, because you're doing too many things at once. Whereas a computer is going to do exactly what you tell it to do. So this is really important. Just either simple things like being able to version up a file. I hit a button and then the version goes from version 1 to version 2. Or if I wanted to be able to do something much more complex, like publish to a different network with different naming conventions, everything else in between. So this is important. What we're doing is we're learning to automate tasks. We're learning to be able to customize the software to bend at our will, rather than using 3D software that was built for 3D printing, for video games, for architectural visualization, for TV, for film, for rides, all these different things that it could be used for, is being developed specifically for our needs and nobody else's. So really important. And let's just talk a bit about the pros and cons. So if anything, a lot of the big pros of being a TD is that you get a lot of diversity in what you're doing. There's always different challenges. It's really fun. It's not doing the same stuff every single day. It's how do we accomplish this? How are we going to go about this? I remember I was working on a commercial where it needed to be, well, kind of like a pincushion effect. I forget what they're called in the US, but basically what it was this pincushion animation that they were going to do stop motion, and we had pushed like we can do it in CG much faster. And this is before all the particle systems were way more complex and could handle the stuff a lot easier. So what we wanted to do is build a script that would create like a bed, like a pincushion type of bed of pins, and then we'd have the animator animate all the stuff they wanted to do. Then we hit a button, and then it actually creates all of the animation, the secondary animation of the pins kind of like settling back down and shooting up and falling down again, creating all the different shapes, all this different stuff, all just as a process. So that way, what would happen is the animator just animates the shots, it can hit a button, and then the pincushion effect gets created for it. And then we have the pincushion animated effect ready to go. We can hit render and it all works. And we can do that every time we get new animation in. You know, every single day there's different challenges, different projects, different things we can focus on. Like I said, we can be much more specific, that we're just a fluids TD or a rigid bodies TD or a cloth TD or hair or comp or pipeline, whatever it might be. But sometimes we want to say, well, I want to do it all. I'm going to be the TD for maybe a smaller studio where I get my hands dirty and everything. So there's different types for different roles for different size studios, but in general, technical directors are going to be paid more than most 3D artists because they give legs to the production. They give legs to what the studio can do. And they're serving all the people around them. They're serving the production. They're making sure that whatever comes in, if there's no solution, they're able to build the solution. I've worked for many different studios over my career, and I was always fascinated by pipeline. So I would look at some studios that would automate everything, 100% automated, programmers doing the whole thing, and I felt like that was too rudimentary. It took too long to get things done. But then I would look at certain studios that were just like, whatever it takes. If you want to go into Photoshop and fix your render layers, you can do that. Like, there's no rules to how you work. And it meant that it was just a mess. People would lose files, things would be messed up. There's just this Wild West kind of mentality going on. But then what I found to be the best studios would be the ones that had artists, and then they had a lot of technical directors, which would be artists, but they could figure out solutions to a lot of the technical problems they're running into. That became really powerful as well. So having people who, when you hit a wall, you're not like, okay, well, we got to go and start again and figure out a different solution. Instead, when you hit a wall, you can build a bridge over that wall. There were artists or TDs that were around that were able to build that bridge, build that solution to solve the problem rather than starting again. There would be a custom solution made specifically to work for what they needed to get done. So always this meant that the TDs were in a position where they're allowing everyone to do their job much better. And on top of that, you're still doing shots, you're doing a lot of different cool stuff. So in general, technical directors are going to get paid a lot more than all the other type of artists out there. It also meant that they're higher in demand because, again, a lot of the time, especially visual effects, we don't know how we're going to do something. Most of the time, clients don't come in and say, hey, I just want the Matrix bullet ripple effect from 20 years ago. You know, I'm sure it's been figured out by now. I just want that in my stuff. They're always looking at, I want something that's never been done before. And that's where we're going to figure out, okay, well, how are we going to do it if that's the case? Because most of what we do is problem solving. Most of what we do is figuring out how are we going to pull this off? And how are we going to do it on budget? How are we going to do it with the schedule that we have? All the different tiers of problems that we need to work within and the constraints, that's what a technical director is going to solve and be able to bring a solution to the problem. So that makes us a lot of time higher in demand because, again, there's going to be always productions where it's like, we need a good TD to be able to solve this. Even right now, I've had ILM hit me up multiple times asking, like, do you know any good TDs that you can recommend? Because we need some really amazing Max technical directors to handle the 3ds Max department at ILM. And we want to be able to code and script and automate and build tools and do all this other stuff. So having a good understanding of all the software, the platforms, the demand, the needs of the artist, all these different things. And that's just it. Like, a programmer is going to build a tool how they think it should work. But a technical director knows how an artist is going to work, so they're going to build things in a way that the artist would use it. There's a massive difference there. And this is why technical directors, I find, are highly irreplaceable. Usually what happens is when a studio starts laying artists off, the technical director is the last people to go, because those technical directors are the ones that are harder to get back again. And on top of that, they can do a lot more. They can solve a lot more problems. They can fend for themselves, but they can also do the job of a lot of other people as well. So it's something just to keep in mind that even if you just have some understanding of a technical director role and be able to do a little bit of that, and then you're able to communicate that to your bosses, it puts you in a place where you're more highly irreplaceable than everyone else around you as well. So that's important to keep in mind. The negative sides, I feel there aren't that many, but overall it means that you're the one who gets dumped with problems and expected to come up with the results. And so there can be a lot of stress at times because you need to figure out, well, how the heck am I going to do this? And sometimes no one else has an understanding about how difficult what you're doing is because they're not in the same position as you. They're not doing all the hard stuff. They just see it as like, go do that task. And they don't really understand like why it's a problem. And especially at smaller studios, if you're the only TD there, which has been a lot of time for me, it means that you're fending for yourself. You're trying to come up with solutions for things that no one else is really able to help you because they don't know how to do any of that stuff. And so that's where it can be kind of difficult when you don't have other TDs around you that you can bounce ideas off of. And that can also be a bit of a difficult thing at times. And that's the other thing too, is that you've got to be an artist, but you also need to understand the technical side as well. So it means that you need to learn a lot more and keep up to date with all the different things going on and be very familiar with what every software package can do, so that way you can leverage it as much as you can to be able to create the best solutions possible given the resources that you have. So all of these are really important. So let's talk a bit more about the specifics of becoming a technical director. One of the things is like, what does it pay? A technical director role can pay anything between $50,000 a year to $320,000 a year. And obviously that's going to be a bit of a bell curve, but there are plenty of TDs who get paid even more than that, but 320 is a really high number that I do know plenty of people being paid around that number for. So the more that you can position yourself at the right studios with the right demands and requirements aligned with what you're doing, the higher number you can really command. So again, like not every studio can pay you $300,000+, but there are going to be certain studios that you can charge $100-$120 an hour being a TD, and they're expecting that because they're hiring people who have a lot of experience and a lot of capability, and they know that those don't come in cheap. That's definitely a big benefit over, let's say, animation or modeling, a lot of roles that A, can be very competitive, and B, don't necessarily pay as much. So this is something to keep in mind. If you want to know more about commanding higher fees, I'll just quickly mention this because I did just put out a pricing class. This is teaching 6 lessons. It's about 8 hours of training, everything I know about how to raise your prices as an artist. So if you want to go to pricingclass.com or pricingclass.com, you'll be able to sign up there. It's completely free. It's about 8 hours of training on how to raise your prices as an artist. So if you're hearing 300K and you're shocked, like that's not real, no one can make that much money, I definitely suggest checking out that free course that I've made, pricingclass.com. That will teach you how to raise your rates and be able to command the fees that you're worth. So let's move on a little bit more. Like I said, you got to be really good at problem solving to be a technical director. That means that typically you're going to be the one who's given something like, why is this not working? Or how would I go about doing this? You've got to be the one to be able to think outside the box and be able to come up with the best solution that's going to work for it. Other times you're going to need to learn to script or learn to code. A big misunderstanding I think a lot of us have as artists is that you need to be good at math. You know, I barely went to school from like grade 4 onwards. I'm not kidding at all. I barely went to school at all. And then when I was 13 years old, second week of grade 9, I quit high school altogether. So I never understood any of the math stuff at all. I learned a little bit later on, but in general, I'm not a big mathematician. I know my multiplication tables and a couple other things like that. So in general, you don't need to know a lot of math. You can code, you can automate, you can write scripts and tools, you can do all this stuff as an artist without needing to know crazy hieroglyphs or, you know, anything crazy with math. And it's more about just having a good way to learn the stuff. I feel like the way I teach artists to do it makes sense to artists. I feel like anytime I've gone to try and learn from courses or tutorials out there from other people, usually they'd say something like, just require some basic high school math. And then the very first lesson, I'm like, all right, I'm out. I don't understand any of what's going on here. So I think it's more about just understanding the right perspective, the right way to go about doing it. I'm definitely going to be putting out some tutorials on how to learn to code and how to script as an artist without needing to know math or anything like that very soon. So keep an eye out for those as well on my YouTube channel. like I said, it's also, as a TD, I think one of the key requirements is understanding the process of your team that you support. In other words, understanding how they work, understanding how a lot of the challenges tend to come up. What's their process, how they go about doing things, is there a better way? But in general, just looking at different solutions that specifically align with their needs rather than doing things your way and only your way. So that also I think is very important too. But let's talk about how to become a TD specifically. I think that the key thing is going to be to learn to script or learn to code. And most technical directors are going to need to know these things. If you don't, it's not the end of the world. I do know some people who are a TD, but they don't know how to script code or anything like that. But in general, it should be on your kind of path eventually to learn. I think it's really critical to eventually start to lean into, okay, this scripting stuff scares me, how do I get started? And start to learn that stuff. Keep it simple. But having some understanding of how to script and how to program is, I think, a very important thing to understand. If you look at Industrial Light and Magic, a majority of the supervisors who work there all had a bachelor in science or some kind of engineering programming background, and that's because they always expected anyone to eventually become a VFX soup there. They would need to have a programming background, and that's just something to keep in mind. Like, different studios, different requirements, different paths, but overall there are going to be, especially in effects and certain roles, the more that you understand this stuff, the more that you understand how to script, how to code, how to build tools, automate tasks, the more attractive you're going to be to the employer. And on top of that, the more legs you're going to have to your career. The higher in demand you're going to be, the more money you can command. So all these are really important, especially if you want to move up to being a lead or a supervisor later on. The more that you understand the technical side of things, you're able to serve your team a lot better as well. So that's also really important. Now, like I said, having the technical side is awesome, but I also think you need to have a good understanding of production. You need to work in production, know how artists work, and also typically understand the process and how we do things too. So the more that you can serve both parts, you can be the technical side, but also be the artist. That way you become a technical director. You're able to leverage the technical side to solve the problems of the creative side. So having experience in production is going to be really important. So usually starting out as an artist rather than just moving directly into a TD role, I think is important. So that way you have a lay of the land. You're able to get your hands dirty, understand how and why people work a certain way, but then you're able to leverage all the technical ability on top of that. So when you are ready to start to move into more of a TD role officially, this is where you can start to dabble in building tools out, in developing scripts. Look to your team and say, hey, like, is there anything that we do that's really tedious? Like, one of my rules is that you should never have to do something more than twice. If you're doing the same task over and over and over, you should make a button for that. Eventually you make buttons for everything. And that means that you're not taking away the creative side of being an artist. What you're doing is freeing up time to be more of an artist, because all the rudimentary stuff of copying files, renaming things, managing the render farm and saving everything out, generating quick times, all the different things, the mundane tasks that we do day to day that really slow us down, you can eradicate all of that by building them out as buttons for everything. So that way you have a tool that pops up, you can type in your information, hit a button, and it does the 30 minutes of stuff that you would have otherwise wasted time on. So the whole idea is that we free up time to be able to spend more time being an artist and less time doing all the mundane stuff that really bogs us down, which I feel is 90% of what we do day to day. In the beginning, look at what you could do to be able to speed up your process. Look at the things that you're doing every single day and look at, well, could I build that into a tool? Or what are the things that the artists around me are doing? Ask everyone, like, hey, if you had a button that could solve a bunch of repetitive tasks that you're doing, like, what would that be? You know, maybe it's just having a light manager that you could say, which lights in the scene have shadows turned on, or which HDRIs are they pathing from? How do I jump to that directory really quickly? Whatever it could be. And the more that you understand the needs of everyone around you, the more that you can start to develop tools to solve those problems and answer those needs. And then from there, eventually your team is going to start to look at you as the solution for a lot of this stuff. This is a chance for you to get recognition for all the time, the work that you're putting in, the problems you're solving, and be able to start to request that you move to more of a technical director role. Like, talk to your manager, talk to your supervisor, talk to the department head and say, hey, I'd like to officially move into a technical director role. I want to start doing this, this, and this. What are your thoughts? What would you want me to do? And how can I start to move into this role? Or when can I start to officially pivot over to officially becoming the technical director to serve or support my team? So that's the general idea. I wanted to throw this out there really quickly, but talk about a lot of this stuff. Get the conversation going. What questions do you have around being a technical director? And is this something that you're interested in doing? Let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So we talked about what is a technical director, and I wanted to talk a little bit about why you'd want this position, as well as what they typically do day to day, how much it pays, the downsides and upsides of it being a TD, how stable the position is, and like I said, it's something that is really helping you become irreplaceable. So that's also how competitive it can be. That's not really something I talked too much about, but I think in general, a TD role is pretty specific. So there's definitely studios that can have hundreds of TDs, but in general, I feel like compared to other roles, you're able to kind of create your own niche for yourself that is very different from everyone else's roles. So therefore, you're not competing with everyone else as much. And the requirements are going to be really about learning both production as well as the technical side, then how to bridge the two, learning as much about every package and software programs to be able to leverage them to the best of the ability that you can. And like I said, what's the typical career path really comes down to what type of studios you want to work for and also what kind of role you want to be in. I have known technical directors who are just there doing stuff in the background. They're not working in production, they're not working on shots. They're just developing tools and helping with the pipeline. But then there's other TDs that are exclusively just working on shots. So it really comes down to what you want. But the good thing is that a TD role can really change over time. If you wanted to move into more being a character TD or a pipeline TD, you can do that. As well as if you wanted to move away from shots or move back into production, you've got that flexibility. So I feel like in general, a TD has a lot more opportunity than most other creative artists do. So I hope that shed some light on what a TD is and also a little bit about how to become one, what areas to lean into. Like I said, let me know what questions you have around this. I think this would be a fun conversation to begin. Okay, what do you think? Thanks for watching. I hope you got a lot from this. If you have any questions, leave a comment below. I would love to hear from you. Also, if you like this subject and you want me to go deep on it with other content as well, feel free to leave even a simple yes to let me know, and I'll definitely follow up with as much content, as much value I can give to you as possible. I also mentioned this earlier, but right now I just released a free course on how to raise your prices as an artist, how to attract your dream clients, as well as how to do your side hustle. I've been in the industry for 25 plus years, both as an artist, as well as a manager, hiring artists and managing them, paying them, so I'm very familiar with this topic. And for me, it's a pet peeve that artists use the excuse that there's no money in art or art doesn't pay, art's not a real career. I want to eliminate the starving artist mindset for good. So that's why I want to share with you 8 hours of training, everything I know about how to price yourself and raise your rates and get what you deserve, as well as building your side hustle as well as an artist. So that way you can leverage your talents to be able to sell assets, be able to do NFTs, everything else in between. So lots to dive into. Check it out, pricingclass.com, or click the link below the video. You can check it out there. Thanks again for watching. So that's it from me. By the way, it would mean the world to me if you could like and subscribe to this channel, as well as share this video, because I would love to keep making more content for you. I appreciate you, and I look forward to continuing to serve you on your journey to success as an artist. I'm Allan McKay, and thanks for watching.